All righty, let's grab our Bibles this morning, turn to Proverbs chapter number 20, and we are going to look at a passage of Scripture that is totally unspectacular. Nice thing about the Proverbs is it deals with everyday kind of living. And I think that this is the reason why it is so rich. God is willing to take some wonderful truths, put it down on the bottom shelf, so that He can help every one of us to have just a better day. Proverbs chapter 20, let's take a look at verse number 8. And the Bible there says, "A king that sitteth in the throne of judgment scattereth away all evil with his eyes. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? Divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Even a child is known by his doings, whether his work be pure and whether it be right. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. Love not sleep, lest thou come to poverty. Open thine eyes, and thou shalt be satisfied with bread. It is not, saith the buyer, but when he is gone his way, then he boasteth." I want to bring a message this morning on the subject, making the best of a bad situation. There are some things in life that are good, some are bad, and some are downright horrible. And what we do when things go bad from worse, we need to start looking for a silver lining, because there will always be one. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it used to be called, was so bad that it wiped out 60% of the population in Europe, which was also 20% of the population of the entire world. There were variations of this Black Death, with one kind being so bad that it could kill a person in the very same day that they contracted it. So how could anything that bad possibly have a silver lining? When the Black Plague started, Europe existed as a gigantic feudal state. There'd be a castle that was owned by a rich landowner, surrounded by outside the realm of that castle were a whole bunch of poor people called peasants who were able to just barely get by, barely having enough to eat. Labor back then was cheap. Life was hard. The Black Plague started when diseased rats arrived on ships coming from China, and they carried with them a killing machine like the world had never seen. In a matter of years, millions of people died horrible and painful deaths. But again, how could anything that bad possibly have anything that could be considered good to come out of it? The Black Plague ushered the world into a modern world. Feudalism was forced to give way to paying people higher wages with better working conditions, because now there were fewer workers available. With this worker shortage, landowners were forced into competition where they were forced to make concessions, and the result was a silver lining of better jobs and higher wages. Another example of how a bad thing brought about something that was good and beneficial was the Crusades. The Crusades was a holy war waged by the Pope and the Catholic Church against all non-Catholics for the control of Jerusalem, a war that lasted for hundreds of years. Specifically, it was a war between the Pope and the Muslims. So what did it accomplish? In relation to the control of Jerusalem, not much. But there was a totally unforeseen benefit that came about from this nonsensical war, which was the discovery of America. The Crusades brought about a dire need for new trade routes. The Ottoman Empire was choking that part of the world, and therefore the Crusades brought about a need for new trade routes. Spain and Portugal were desperately trying to find sailors who could find another route to make their way to China, and they came upon an individual by the name of Christopher Columbus who was searching for such a trade route. Thanks to the Crusades, Christopher Columbus got his financing ended up discovering America and opening up a new world of exploration and ultimately the founding of the United States of America. In this passage, Solomon is going to reveal the positive benefits that came about from things that didn't start out all that great. In fact, some of them started out bad. And yet, if a person is willing to look at a bad situation, trying to find that silver lining, they can always manage to find for themselves a better life. Verse number 8. First thing this morning is this: a harsh ruler can be a good thing. A king that sitteth in the throne of judgment scattereth away all evil with his eyes. Back in 1939, The Wizard of Oz hit Hollywood's silver screen, and Judy Garland became a star. From her ruby red slippers to her dog Toto, Dorothy was a huge hit because she managed to make her way through Munchkinland to find this wonderful Wizard of Oz. And what was the Wizard of Oz like? Well, he was kind and a gentle soul who liked to pretend that he was tough. But when the curtain was pulled back and people could really see who this guy was and what he was like, he was really a nice guy. He was so gentle, so benevolent. The wizard gave a medal of courage to the cowardly lion. He gave a new brain to the empty-headed scarecrow and a tender heart to the Tin Man. And to Dorothy, he gave instructions of just clicking your heels together and you'll be back home in Kansas. A lot of people who were watching The Wizard of Oz were probably thinking, wow, I wish my boss was like him. He's such a nice guy. Why can't I have a nice leader like him? He's so sweet and gentle and kind. We as a nation just finished not long ago 8 years of a president who was kind and gentle with the nations of the world. And the result was they ran over him like a Mack truck running over a marshmallow. Leaders and marshmallows don't go together. In fact, they're a disaster because the bad guys will only do us harm if they can get by with it. So what kind of leaders are the best kind of leaders? According to Solomon, the best leaders are those who can strike fear into the hearts of others with nothing more than a look. You know, the kind that Mom used to give us when we were growing up. When we were cutting up and misbehaving, and Mom would look at us like, wait until I get you home. That kind of a look. It wasn't a Wizard of Oz moment like you were going to really get what you were whining for. Instead, it was one of those knowing looks of an executioner as the man's head is being put on a chopping block. For the past several months, President Trump has been criticized by the left because of how harsh and mean he has been with the North Koreans. He called their leader Rocket Man, making fun of him. He sent warships to that part of the country, and a lot of people thought that he was very foolishly pushing us into a war with North Korea. And then some strange things kind of happened. The North Koreans decided that maybe President Trump was crazy enough to do what he said he was going to do. And instead of continuing to shoot missiles toward our country, he paid a visit. The leader of North Korea, paid a visit to South Korea, pledging to end the war that has been going on for decades. How did that happen? We finally got a leader who could strike fear into the hearts of the bad guys with just a look. Verse number 9. Our failure allows us to enjoy God's success. Who can say, I have made my heart clean? I am pure from my sin. When a person gets saved, they first experience an awareness that they are totally incapable of helping themselves. When they feel that heavy weight of sin, they understand they cannot remove those sins. They can't remove the guilt that is weighing upon them. They can't avoid the reality that they will spend an eternity in hell because they're lost. They realize that they're spiritually on rock bottom and they will remain there until they're rescued by somebody else. And salvation is the result of our allowing Christ to be that somebody else. And what was it that brought us to the place where we would be willing to turn our lives over to Christ? It was our failure to run our own lives. It is for this reason that wealth and education are the two biggest enemies of a person being saved. Both of those things can fool a person into thinking that they're in control. When a person has money, they don't need God because they're in control of their own life. College graduates are some of the most difficult people in the world to reach. You know why? Because they're smarter than the average bear, they think. And they don't need him. They're in control. They have a piece of paper hanging on the wall. They're in control. They got all this money in the bank. And both of those things have the capacity to fool a person into thinking that they're actually in control of their lives. Unfortunately, those two things create an illusion that is not real. Because success without Christ is nothing more than a satanic illusion. It is for this reason that failure is actually one of the greatest, best things that a person can experience, because it is failure that opens our eyes to the fact that we need Christ to begin with. Verse number 10. Third thing this morning is this: dishonesty revealed brings fairness to all. Divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. One of the most famous fires in this country took place in New York City back in 1911. It was at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that was located on the top 3 floors of a 10-story building. This factory made women's blouses, and the supervisors would regularly lock all the doors except one, forcing all of the workers at quitting time to go through that one choke point so that they could keep an eye on them, making sure that none of those women were stealing anything from the factory. The women back then were making $7 a week. They were immigrants from Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe, some of them as young as 12 years old. The factory was littered, had these garbage bins where discarded fabric was stacked inside of them. The people that were designing the clothes were always sitting there smoking at their desks, tossing their cigarette butts into these garbage bins. But they were never concerned because they always kept a bucket of water, because fires were always starting and they were always putting them out. One day near closing time, somebody shouted fire on the 8th floor. Panic swept through that floor as the fire quickly spread up to the 9th and the 10th floors as well. Women began crushing one another, trying to get into the one elevator that existed. When it was jammed, then they were crawling out the windows, getting to the fire escape. Some managed to get up to the roof, where they were going to be waiting until they were roasted alive. The fire escape had so many people on it, it collapsed. The elevator could not handle all of the people that were trying to use it. Women were forced to jump out the windows, and the fire department, when they finally showed up, they were torn between catching these bodies that were falling through the sky with their safety nets or trying to put the flames out. On the roof of the building, there was a college professor who took some ladders that had been left behind by painters, and he created a bridge from one 10-story building to the next adjoining 10-story building, and the women were forced to straddle that ladder 10 stories high to get to a different building. That college professor ended up saving 69 women. 146 people died in that fire. Public outrage was so bad that New York City created 36 brand new laws. They, for the first time, created a new fire inspection effort where people would go from building to building, checking out businesses to make sure that there were no safety hazards there. In other words, because of that tragedy and the horrible working conditions that existed, businesses were forced to have safer working conditions, which then ultimately benefited everyone. Nobody likes to be cheated or taken advantage of. God hates it. And because of that, He will use good people to help bring about an end to this kind of corruption so as to be a blessing to other people, especially His own people. Verse number 11. Poor character can be overcome by hard work. This is really, really a nice, wonderful truth. Verse 11, even a child is known by his, circle the word doings in this verse, whether his work be pure and whether it be right. This verse is commonly used to stress the importance of teaching children how to work. Being a hard worker is one of the best reputations that a person can have because it reveals an above average level of character. But what happens if a child is allowed to be lazy? What happens if parents are too lax in raising their kids and their children end up with a bad reputation as they become an adult? We've all heard the saying, back to basics. The reason is because basics are so crucial that without them, a person can't do much in the way of rebuilding any kind of a damaged life. So how important are the basics? Did you know that a child can walk too soon? And that it has been proven that crawling helps their learning? Crawling helps the brain to develop both sides more fully, while also developing upper body strength. Crawling also helps develop hand-eye coordination. Crawling also helps a child to become a better problem solver. And the problem is that too many parents are pushing their kids to walk as quickly as possible so that they can take a picture of that first step, thinking that my child is so gifted, look how soon they're walking. And their pride is actually cheating their baby out of the basics of crawling. So if crawling helps to promote physical coordination, if crawling helps to promote problem solving, and if crawling helps to develop core strength in a person's body, what is the equivalent of crawling when it comes to building character? You ready for this? Work. Back to the basics. Work touches upon so many areas of a person's life. Work builds confidence. Work develops physical strength. Work forces a person to learn how to communicate and interact with other people. Work sometimes creates humility when we fail. And work also teaches a person how to set goals and how nice it is to achieve those goals. And if a person has acquired a bad reputation in life, if they will strive to become a hard worker, that hard work is the way to get out of the doghouse and to build a new and better reputation for themselves. Verse number 12. Fifth thing this morning is this: creation can lead to salvation. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. When the sun arose this morning, making a beginning of a brand new day, it unveiled something that is so simple that a child can grasp it, and yet it is so complicated that a person with a PhD will miss it. It's called God's creation. Ask any one of our elementary kids who created the world and who created the animals and the oceans and the fish, and they will tell you that God did it. If you'd been able to ask the famous brain, Stephen Hawking, the most famous astronomist physicist from England who created the world, you would have heard a lot of big words that were supposed to impress you, but you would never have heard him say or mention God as its creator. Evolution is now the most accepted myth that is jammed full of baloney. And the strangest thing of all is that they can claim that evolution is true without smiling or laughing, and yet in their heart they know that it's not true. God has placed, the Bible tells us, God has placed a knowledge of Himself in the heart of every person. So what is evolution? It is the nonsensical belief that given enough time, cells can move about and create things like the hearing ear and the seeing eye. And what is the key to evolution? Time. The more time that these cells have to rearrange themselves, the better that things will become. So how exactly does evolution work? Evolution tells us that if you were to take a Volkswagen, put it out in the middle of the desert, and leave it there for billions of years, when you come back for it, you'll find a Cadillac. That's what evolution does. Is that currently what we see? There's a reason why we have more and more scrap heaps and junkyards in this country. The reason is because we buy things that are new, and over time, they get worse, not better. And instead of evolving into something better, they get broken and carried out as trash. So how can anyone intelligently explain how an eye can see and how an ear can hear? In order to get a simple enough answer for you to understand, you have to ask a child. And if that child grew up, raised in a Christian home, they will probably give you the correct answer, which is God did it. When my wife and I got married, we were married by her home pastor, Reverend Baster, who was the longtime pastor of her Lutheran church. He was an older man, and I can recall when we had gotten out of the Army, we were living over in Terre Haute, and we'd go back to southern Indiana periodically to see the folks and that sort of thing. And I remember one time going back to her home church. I was not a college graduate yet, but I was well on my way. I was sitting in a church service, and I started snickering to myself because he alluded to what he described as a fact that God created Adam and Eve. And of course I knew better, because I'd been to college. You see, I had a college professor that told me that that's not true. Evolution is how things came about. And I believed him. They sold me an expensive textbook that backed up that very thing. And so behind me was Indiana State University, behind me was a college professor, and behind me was an expensive textbook. And in front of me, behind a pulpit, was an ignorant old man who actually believed the Bible. And I thought to myself, what a fool. But then I got saved, and I started seeing things a little bit differently. And when I got saved, the scales that had been blinding me fell off my eyes, and I could see things that I'd never seen before. And I saw the wisdom of taking the Bible at face value. If the devil can somehow erase this idea that God created everything, if he can make that disappear, he also hides the purpose of God's creation. And the purpose for all of this is simply to show to the world how to be saved. Because God is behind it all. And that shows us our need for salvation. Verse number 13. Our flesh is a thief that cannot be trusted. Love not sleep, lest thou come to poverty. Open thine eyes, wake up, and thou shalt be satisfied with bread. This thing called sleep is a drum that Solomon seems to be banging on through the whole book of Proverbs. But what's wrong with sleep? Sleep is great and needful, but it fits into a category of too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. To overindulge in sleep is to overindulge the flesh. And the problem is that our flesh doesn't have any character. It wants to do things that it enjoys. It wants to do things that makes it feel good or look good. It wants to do things that promotes an attitude of selfishness. The goal of flesh is unrestricted worldliness. If the world is getting tattoos, then the flesh wants a tattoo also. If the world is wearing red or green or blue hair with a nose ring, then let's dye our hair and get pierced. And what's the grand result of indulging the flesh, as told by Solomon? Poverty. That might be in terms of dollars and cents, or it might be poverty in character. But the flesh is a very costly beast that is very high maintenance. Probably the most famous animal trainers in the world were two men called Siegfried and Roy. They were lion tamers who raised tigers and lions from the time that they were cubs. They worked in Vegas for years, sticking their head inside of the mouths of lions and doing all sorts of stunts with these big cats until 2003. And what happened in 2003? That's when Roy Horn was bitten on the neck by a 7-year-old white tiger and dragged around the arena. Roy Horn lived, but he was never the same. On the way to the hospital, he died 3 times and was brought back to life. He was partially paralyzed from a stroke, and he's still limited physically because of the attack. So what does the flesh have in common with the big cats that were raised and trained by Siegfried and Roy? You can train the flesh all of your life, but there is a difference between training it and taming it. They're not the same. You can train your flesh by telling it no, but you'll never tame it. And it's always waiting for that door to be left unlocked so that it can slip out and see what it can get by with. Only a fool is willing to treat a tiger as a pet. Verse number 14, last thing this morning is this: bargains are not always a good deal. It is not, saith the buyer, but when he has gone his way, then he boasteth. I know this morning that we have professional shoppers with us in this crowd. And I also know that everybody is always looking for a good deal. And there's nothing wrong with that up to a point. According to Solomon, the natural position of a buyer is to find fault with this merchandise, and by finding what's wrong with something, you can get the price brought down to where it's a good deal. And that's being a good steward. Because it's foolish to throw good money away on something that's not worth that. That's why whenever we have some big jobs done around the church, we get bids on the job. And if a good worker over here can do it cheaper than a more expensive worker over here, if we can get the better deal, that's what we do. We don't throw the money around just because it's not ours. And you shouldn't either. You need to be good stewards. You need to be looking for bargains. Nothing wrong with that. But when is getting a bargain not a good deal? It's called taking advantage of somebody. I've been ripped off enough times to know what it feels like. And I made up my mind a long time ago that that's not the kind of person that I'm going to be. When trying to get a good deal on something, there's nothing wrong pointing out the flaws. There's nothing wrong haggling on the price. But when the seller is a poor person and they're in need of money and they already have it priced at a fair price, I have a problem with trying to push the price down even more so just because I know that I can. That's not the time to see how low you can get the price brought down. There is a bargain price where you're glad for the price and where they're glad to get their money as quickly as possible. But then there's also the price that is driven down so low that you're hurting the other person and you're angering the Lord. So how do you keep from crossing that line? Your goal in this world as a Christian should be fairness. A business has a right to earn a profit. A seller has a right to keep or sell a product, and you should be satisfied when you're able to buy something at a fair price. Because a fair price is a win-win for everybody and a good way to keep God's blessings coming your way. And what happens if you encounter a person who is hurting financially and they're forced to sell something at a loss? Let me share with you something that I have done in the past more than once. When I happen to find something on Craigslist that I like, or I list something and somebody's buying something from me or I'm buying something from them, I'm trying to sell or I'm trying to buy at a fair price. And if I happen to feel that I'm getting a real good deal, and I can see that person doesn't have much, I'll make the deal, and then I'll slip them $20 back for some gas money. Find the bargain. But we don't need to sell our soul for it. And no matter how good the deal is, there's nothing wrong with maintaining a good Christian testimony. And I'll tell you what makes it even sweeter and better is when you give them a gospel tract so that they can not only know that, hey, that person was nice to me, but well, look at this. And God is brought into the picture of things. Solomon has just given us everyday kind of living advice. how to be a nice guy, and how to enjoy a great life as well. Let's bow for prayer. Father, would you please bless each and every person here this morning? And Holy Spirit, would you help us this morning to understand the fact that we're always living under a magnifying glass. Either lost people are looking at everything that we're saying and doing, or else you're looking over our shoulder at everything that we're thinking and what's in our hearts. And so, Holy Spirit, I pray that you'd help us to be careful about our flesh. It wants to get loose. And Holy Spirit, help us to be careful about our reputation. Help us to be a good, hard worker. Help us to be fair and honest. Help us to be the kind of person that people are glad and happy to have met.